Hello everyone, Dr. Bauer's Office Hours here, and today we're just going to do a short video about Plato's formal theory of relations. It most famously stands out in Republic around 438 to 440. Here's some study guide questions to help us cover it. Which types of relations have formal objects? What is the formal object of a relation? How can we apply this analysis of formal objects to Plato's examples? How can we extend this analysis of formal objects with more examples? As always, you may want to write these questions down beforehand and then fill them out, occasionally pausing the video to do so as we go through our discussion. The following analysis, which talks about relations in terms of formal objects and x's and y's, you can find in David Reeves' excellent book, Philosopher Kings, The Argument of Plato's Republic, which is published by Hackett, and I'm going to be drawing on it in this discussion. When we talk about relations, we don't just mean relationships like social relations. Relationships include things like being a spouse to someone or being a brother or a sister to someone, but relations in general are ways that things can be situated or connected in a very, very broad sense. This includes being next to something. If A is next to B, A and B are related by the next to relation. Being between something. If B is between A and C, then B stands in the between relation to the pair of A and C. Likewise with liking Chinese food more than. That's a relation. Being taller than is a relation. Being louder than is a relation. Being earlier to Denny's than is a relation. All of these are various ways that things can be situated or connected, broadly speaking. Now, Plato's theory of relations focuses on a very specific subset of that general category. Plato focuses on dyadic relations, or two-place relations. These are relations whose ascription requires mentioning something and doing so again. I don't say that the ascription of a dyadic relation requires mentioning two things, because a thing might stand in a dyadic relationship to itself. I look exactly like myself. I am also my own worst critic. So I stand in the looking exactly alike relation to myself, and I also stand in the worst critic of relation to myself. Those are two dyadic relations in which I stand in them to myself, so it would be wrong to describe a dyadic relation as one whose ascription requires mentioning two things. But it does require two mentionings. The relation has two places, in other words. Plato's theory of relations is a theory of two-place relations, or at least the following bit of analysis will assume so. Now, what is the formal object of a relation? The formal object of a relation R is whatever feature a thing Y must have in order for a thing X to properly stand in R to Y. Again, a formal object of a relation R is whatever feature a thing Y must have in order for a thing X to properly stand in R to Y. The occurrence of the word properly is important, but in order to get a secure, more basic understanding, we will proceed in stages, and the first stage of explaining this is to ignore properly for now. We'll come back to it. The first thing to note is that the formal object of a relation is a feature. It's a way that something can be. Maybe something can be that way all by itself, and any duplicate of that thing would also be that way, in which case it's an intrinsic feature. Or maybe a thing only gets to be that way by being connected to other things, and so you could have an exact copy of that thing that wasn't that way, in which case it's an extrinsic feature. But regardless of whether the feature is something a thing has all on its own, or whether the feature is something a thing has in virtue of its connections to other things, the formal object of a relation is a feature. It's a way that something could be. More specifically, the formal object of a relation is a way that the second term would have to be in order for the first term to stand in that relation to it. Now, this is all very abstract, so let's zoom in on a few examples, Plato's examples, and talk about them. At 438a5, the topic is introduced. Socrates says, "But surely, whenever things are related to something, those that are of a particular sort are related to a particular sort of thing, as it seems to me, whereas those that are just themselves are related only to a thing that is just itself." Glaucon, perhaps anticipating the reader, says he does not understand. Socrates says, "Don't you understand that the greater is such as to be greater than something?" Of course. Than the less. Yes. And the much greater than the much less. Isn't that so? Yes, says Glaucon. So let's take that first example, greater than. That's a two-place relation. X is greater than Y. What would Y have to be like in order for X to be greater than it? What in general does something have to be like in order for you to be greater than it, or for something to be greater than it? It has to be less. So the feature of being less is the formal object of the greater than relation. In order for X to be greater than Y, Y has to have the feature of being less. Continuing, consider the relation of being much greater than. What would something have to be like in order for you to be much greater than it? Right, it would have to be much less. The formal object of the much greater than relation, therefore, is the feature of being much less. Let's go on. Socrates continues, "And the much greater than the much less, isn't that so? And the once greater than the once less, and the going to be greater than the going to be less." So, let's consider the relation of being once greater than. X was once greater than Y. X was once greater than Y. Maybe it still is, maybe it isn't. But X was once greater than Y. What does Y have to be like in order for X to be related to it in that way? What feature must Y have? Y must be once less. In order for X to have been once greater than Y, Y must have to have been once less. Likewise for going to be greater and going to be less. In order for it to be true that X is going to be greater than Y, it must be true that Y is going to be less. This definition here is capturing the examples nicely. Let's continue. And doesn't the same hold of the more in relation to the fewer, the double to the half, and everything of that sort? So in order for X to stand in the more than relation to Y, Y must have to have the feature of being fewer. And in order for X to stand in the double than relation to Y, in order for something to be double another thing, that other thing must be half. And also of heavier to lighter, and faster to slower, and in addition, of hot to cold and all other similar things. We see this general pattern that Socrates first mentions a relation and then ties it to what, according to this formula, is its formal object. Going on, we get an interesting twist on this idea. What about the various kinds of knowledge? Aren't they the same way? Knowledge itself is of what can be learned itself, or of whatever we should take the object of knowledge to be, whereas a particular knowledge of a particular sort is of a particular thing of a particular sort. I mean something like this. When knowledge of building houses was developed, it differed from the other kinds of knowledge, and so was called knowledge of building. Isn't that so? What does something have to be like in order for you to mathematically study it? What does something have to be like in order for it to be knowable through mathematics, be mathematically studyable or mathematically knowable? It has to be mathematically scrutable. It has to admit of a certain structure that is accessible to mathematics. What about the relation of being chemically knowable? X has chemical knowledge of Y. In order for that to be the case, y must be chemically scrutable. And likewise for the other kinds of knowledge. If x biologically knows y, then y must be biologically scrutable. And if x musically knows y must be musically scrutable. And likewise for all other kinds of knowledge. For something to be knowable in a certain way, it must be scrutable in a certain way. The Republic is not the only one of Plato's dialogues in which this theory of relations comes in, however. Of particular note is the Symposium when Socrates questions Agathon. He asks, "Is love such as to be a love of something or of nothing?" He's asking what love is directed at, or what the relationship of loving is of. Let's continue. I'm not asking if he is born of some mother or father, but it's as if I'm asking this about a father, whether a father is the father of something or not. You'd tell me, of course, that if you wanted to give me a good answer, that it's of a son or a daughter, that a father is the father, wouldn't you? Socrates goes on to explain, and to talk about how Diotima explained to him, that the formal object of love is the beautiful, or beauty. Here's where proper comes into it. Remember, the formal object of a relation R is whatever feature a thing Y must have in order for a thing X to properly stand into R to Y. This is a normative notion, or perhaps a teleological notion. There's an idea of what's proper or what's good or what's purposive smuggled into this idea. Is it possible to love something that's not beautiful? Absolutely. But what is the proper object of love? What is love supposed to be directed at? And let's not be uncharitable to Plato. Remember, in the Symposium, physical beauty and physical appearances are not what real beauty amounts to. The proper object of love, what it's supposed to be directed at, thinks Plato, is beauty. To see how this notion of propriety works, let's consider an example of Aristotle's. The idea that fear is directed at the dangerous. Is it proper to fear something that is not dangerous? Absolutely. It's also possible to not fear something that is dangerous. But those are occasions in which you might argue that your fear is malfunctioning or not working properly as it should. Fear is properly directed at danger. That's what it's supposed to be directed at. So with this analysis of what a formal object is, let's extend it. What would be the formal object of the burning relation? X burns Y. If X burns Y, what does Y have to be like in order for X to properly burn it? That's right, Y has to be flammable. The formal object of the burning relation is the flammable. What about the revenge for relation? If X is revenge for Y, what must Y be like if X is properly revenge for Y? If I take revenge for something, what must that thing be like if I'm doing it properly? Y must be an insult. You take revenge for an insult. Or at least that's what Plato and Aristotle thought. There's the fearing relation I just mentioned. If X fears Y, what must Y be like in order for X to properly fear it? Y must be dangerous. What about the disgusted by relation? What must something be like in order for you to be properly disgusted by it? You could just say the disgusting, I suppose. But what about the contaminating? That which threatens to dirty and to get inside of. You might think that's the formal object of the disgust relation. The formal object of disgust is the contaminating, just as the formal object of fear is the dangerous, and the formal object of burning is the flammable. In discussions of art, many people note that the emotion of horror, being horrified by something, and by the way, that's an emotion that an entire genre of fiction is named after, is a compound emotion. Horror is the combination of fear and disgust. So what would the formal object of the horrified by relation be? It should be a combination of the formal object of the fear relation and the formal object of the disgusting relation. It should be something that is dangerous and disgusting. The monstrous. The formal object of the horrified by relation is the monstrous. And so on. Can you think of some fun examples of your own? Thanks for watching, everyone. Goodbye.